Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Education, Business, Administration Subcommittee, the Budget and Taxation Committee, where we're meeting for the purpose of a budget hearing on the Department of Information Technology. As customary, we first start out with the analyst's analysis, and then we have the agency response. We're first going to hear from Patrick Frank. Mr. Frank, take it away.
Okay, as you can see from the first chart here, this is the spending from 2022 to 2023. The large blue part that is increasing, that is general funds, and the reason for those increases are primarily due to additional spending on major IT projects and cybersecurity measures. We'll go right into the managing for results indicators. The first one has to do with the major IT projects. The way that the projects are built now is different than a few years ago. It used to be what they called waterfall, where there was a great deal amount of planning done ahead of time, and then the system was built, and then you turn it on, and I guess cross your fingers when you turn it on. But what's done now with more of these projects is something called agile, and what it's a much more iterative approach in which you build components, and then you should, every 6 months, you should have a new component ready and that you can put in the field. And so you're, in a sense, you're building and working and testing while you're doing it. And so because of that, the MFR indicators have also changed. And one of the indicators we have, if you see that red line over there, is that you could, with this kind of approach, you could much more measure as you're going along what's happening with your project. And so, and that's what they're doing in that indicator. And so they're trying to get it so that at least 80% is what has been in 2021 of projects are meeting their objectives and the criteria that were set out for them. Also, another thing that this agency does is provide a lot of day-to-day IT services for other state agencies. Here's their MFR indicators for this have to do with, you know, how much volume they're doing and what, you know, % of their tickets are resolved in 24 hours or with the first contact and things like that. And these are all very good indicators. But we have a recommendation for narrative that essentially asks that they also include some kind of a value indicator. Because this is all, and it's all well and good to do that, what they have, but maybe expand that a little bit. And now that's our first recommendation. Now there is, as I said earlier, quite a bit of money for cybersecurity, but first I'll mention that the dedicated purpose account, not this budget, but as you heard in the Senate full committee hearing, has $100 million this year, and there's still $10 million from a prior year. So there's $110 million. This hasn't been spent yet, and we're not sure exactly how it's going to be spent. I mean, we do agree that this is a need. So we're asking here for then some narrative, that kind of report that kind of shows a plan of how they're going to be doing this. Also going to mention that that there were some federal stimulus funds that the agency received, about $5 million of it. $1 million is particularly interesting. It went to, for the state to build a virtual private network, or VPN. And the idea, and this is we're going to talk about this quite a bit more as the analysis goes on. And this is, you know, it's basically a more closed network that agencies can be working in. And it's really made for cybersecurity. And what they're doing is first building the kind of a pilot program, a prototype for it, and then they'll expand it, and more agencies come onto it. And that's partly, and there's also a major IT project to expand this. And so we're also actually in favor of that. I mean, that's a very good idea, we think. Let's see. And okay, into the agency spending. As you can see here, about 43% of the budget is for the major IT projects. That's a big part of their budget, what they do. They also have the infrastructure. Those are things like including phone lines and things like that, but the networks and all of that the state has. It's also application system management, which is kind of like the accounting system and things like that, and GIS, which is mapping that they use. So there's a number of different agency support they provide. There's 6% or $16 million is for security, that's cybersecurity, and there's a radio program in this agency as well. If you look at the spending here, what's interesting about this is 9% of the agency spending is on salaries and fringe benefits for employees, and another 83% is for contracts, be it for operations or for the major IT projects. So this is an agency that is, you know, basically one out of every $11 is spent on salaries, and it's 10 times as much is spent on the contract. So this is they're very much a contract management agency. And also, the next chart will show you there's a number of different fund sources that this agency receives. The bluish ones are for the Major Information Technology Development Project Fund, which is the fund that supports the major IT. They get $114 million in general fund this year, and a little bit of special funds as well from resource sharing agreements. The green, that's for their operations, and that's primarily funded through reimbursable funds. And what they're doing is they're charging other agencies for the services that they're providing. There's also some general funds for their administration, which is about 12% of their budget, and then they get a little bit of the federal funds that I had mentioned earlier. Usually I skip over the where it goes chart because the issues are more interesting, but for this agency I think I'll mention it. And what I really want to point out is on page 11, as you can see, cybersecurity related costs. These are the additional costs in the budget this year. So they're getting $10 million for additional security assessments. They're getting $5 million to replace older hardware that has some risks with encryption issues and or weaknesses for getting into other systems for cybersecurity reasons. And also they're getting $3 million for kind of like endpoint and software and to do, protect those vulnerabilities. And what's interesting about this, though, is this money is actually double budgeted in this agency, which happens is they get $3 million for general funds, and then it's moved in as a reimbursable fund somewhere else. So if you add them up, it's $6 million, but it's only $3 million. It's the same number. It's just spent. It just shows up in two different areas of the agency budget. Okay. A new program that they have, and this came out of an executive order from the summer, July of 2021, and they have now what's called a state chief privacy officer and a state chief data officer, and these work for the governor's office. But the idea here is, and a lot of states are doing this now. They're kind of watching this and providing guidance to agencies with respect to privacy and data. The idea with data is to get as much data out there as possible. I mean, this is a good idea, we think, because if you think of the three things, I guess the cornerstone of really the systems and cybersecurity is CIA confidentiality, integrity, and access. And so the privacy officer obviously will be very concerned about the confidentiality, and access is really the data officer too. So this really is within the mission of that they're doing. But unfortunately, all we know about this is what it says in the executive order. We'd like to learn a little more about what they're doing. They're also getting about $3 million. I didn't mention it earlier. To begin some programs, and we'd like to know to get more information, so we're asking for narrative about that. Because there's a lot of new money in the budget, unfortunately there's going to be a lot of narrative to try to explain what all is going on. I'll go through this quickly because this is a story you've heard many times before. Vacancy rate since 2017, pretty much always above 10%, unfortunately. The declines that you see in 2020, a lot of that is not because more positions were filled, but because some vacancies were abolished. And so the rate went down because the denominator of the fraction shrank, not because the numerator got bigger. Also, what I've done, I did this in other analyses too, and that is kind of look at what step employees are in the agency and if you look at employees hired in 2021 are on step 16. Now the way the system works, they abolished base, but now it goes from I think 1 to I think 22 are the steps. So when you're getting hired in this agency, at least in 2021, you're already up 3/4 up the pay scale. The point here is that the pay scale is not very competitive. And this is a good indication of it, that you have to hire somebody close to the top of the pay in order as a starting position. And what happens with that? Oftentimes it's hard to keep them then very long, and that's why part of the issues with turnover. Next, I will turn to the major IT fund. Basically, there's the general funds as its main sources I mentioned earlier. It also does have some money from the resource sharing agreements, and that's an issue I'll talk more about later. And it does earn its own income, so investment interest, it gets a little bit. Basically, if you look at the spending, this is an example of how IT spending on major projects has changed over the years. 10 years ago, or in 2014, I should say, it was about $20 million in general funds. by 2020 is up to 80 million, and now we're over 100 million. These are projects that are needed. I remember about 10 years ago, there were maybe 8, 9, 10 projects that they were working on. Now there's Appendix 2 has 32 different projects that are all receiving some kind of general fund. So this is this state's commitment to major IT has increased substantially in recent years. And there's an out-year forecast here as well. If you look at 24, 25, and 26, we're still in the $100 million range next year, then above 70 million. And those are projects we know about. This is assumed no new projects. Now, there probably will be some new projects, so I suspect these numbers are a bit modest. And the first issue, after kind of going over what's in the budget, is cybersecurity. Basically, the threats and the solutions are evolving. There's some really interesting data about what's happening with cybersecurity, but I'll start with our cybersecurity indicators. And these are the MFR indicators. A couple I want to point out. One is, if you look at the green bar, that's protecting endpoints with critical patches and things like that. That declined in 2021. And one of the reasons for that was a lot of these things you had to do in person, and because of the social distancing and all that, that became more difficult to do, which is kind of an interesting paradox. We've heard that pretty much everybody agrees that cybersecurity threats are more dangerous now than they were before the pandemic, yet the pandemic has made protecting our IT assets more difficult. And so the question, there's no narrative here, but there's a question of what's the department doing to deal with this particular problem. Also, what I do every year, and this is a great source of information, is review the Office of Legislative Audit's IT findings. And so what I've done this year, I've kind of grouped it. It's always difficult to come up with some way of scoring this to make it interesting. And so this year I came up with high and low findings. If 3 or more is high, 1 or 0 is low. And so what's interesting is what's in the high, always been high, and still is high in 2021. And unfortunately, PII is it. Another one that's a difficult one is the unnecessary user or file access. So the issue here is if somebody gets into my work, then they have access to all my work. If my work has access to more than I need to be working on, then that other areas are vulnerable then too. And so this is a problem, and it can make things worse. What's interesting, a new one here is, this is no surprise, I would imagine, is the VPN access problems. This used to be a rare issue. It didn't even show up every year. Now, in the last year, there were 4 of these. And that's another reason why I think that the VPN project that they're doing is important. Is not only is that make work more efficient, make it more secure, and so it's definitely a step in the right direction. Good news is anti-malware. There weren't any findings about not using that. Also a good one is administration rights. That used to be a common one to be found, and there weren't any findings this last time around. And so that's a similar issue as the file access, and that's is even more dangerous one because administration rights are generally pretty broad. There was one really strange one this year, and that was an agency that actually had a ransomware attack. Gave them some advice and made some recommendations about fixing things, and a year later they still had a number of items that they didn't fix. And so this is kind of important. That's kind of a disconcerting one. Let's hope that doesn't show up again, because everybody knows their vulnerabilities. You should really address those immediately. Also, DoIT this year did their own survey of what's going on in state agencies, and I showed some of the things here. I'll just point out a couple of them I think that are interesting. The one that I found most interesting and a little bit disconcerting, I guess, would be the number of agencies that still have legacy systems. It's 40% still do. And the problem with legacy systems is that they'll have a lot of software that's dated and not protected as well. And so that's additional vulnerabilities. And that's why sometimes some of the problems with cybersecurity aren't that you're not doing everything you can, but because of the age of your systems, there's some things now have become obsolete, and there are some vulnerabilities. And that's why it's important for the major IT project to be addressing some of those legacy systems. Let's see. That was kind of. Oh, and another thing is, And so we'll talk about this again as well, as multi-factor authentication. This is kind of where the world is moving. And agencies probably should do more of this, and it shows that, you know, with email, it's about 63% have it, and for remote access, it's 47%. Let's see. Oh yeah, this is a really fascinating. There was also, SolarWinds is an IT company, and I think it was about 400 people that they surveyed, and they asked them some general questions about where the threats are, what they thought in 2019, and then I guess in 2021 again. And what's really interesting about this is in the past, the conventional wisdom was it's careless and untrained insiders and employees are the biggest problem. People have said that for as long as I can remember. And that was the case in 2019. But if you look at now in 2021, just the hackers are much more of a problem now. They're perceived by these 400 IT professionals. So that's a really big change, and that's also kind of surprising, I guess. And also hacktivists are also moving up now as far as dangers. So some of these dangers are, this is an example of how the threats are changing and also becoming more dangerous. And so I suppose there's a better hacker community out there than there was in the past. They also talked about, they also asked about which kinds of solutions were the most important. And so what I did, I listed here those that were 75% of the respondents, 75% or more of the respondents thought were very important. And some observations from that are, first of all, what's interesting is the IT education and training was not in that 75% threshold, which surprised me a little bit. It was just barely under it. If I could have lowered the threshold to get them in there, but I decided at the beginning, I said, just pick 75, that's a good round number, see what shows up in there. Also, it talks about, one of the things they talked about is how important VPNs are, especially if you have a teleworking workforce. Multi-factor authentication, again, is becoming more and more important because passwords get compromised. And this is another way of reinforcing the system. And also the thing about privileged access was another thing that was important is you know, there's this concept of least privilege access. In other words, you only get to do what you absolutely have to do, and so that if you get compromised, there's less vulnerable. Just to end this cybersecurity issue, it also looks forward to the SolarWinds report, and it looked at like how often people teleworking. Before the pandemic, they said about, you know, it was not much. And what's interesting is in the future, we're probably going to be, even if, you know, there's no more pandemic, the sense is that we'll be teleworking more, and more people will be teleworking always and more. And so the message I get from this is telework is probably here to stay. Let's see. Okay, the second issue, and this will go much quicker than the first one, is just probably should mention the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or something, I believe it's called, IIJA, that provided some money for cybersecurity. We, you know, based on population data, expect Maryland to get between 1.6 and 6.4 million annually for this program from federal 2022 to 2025. Of that money, 80% goes to local governments, and 20% of that of the large total goes to rural local governments. I guess at this point there is no plan that the state has for how to disperse that money. So yeah, I ask for narrative for that they do that. I do observe in this that DO-IT doesn't have any grant programs, but the Maryland Department of Emergency Management does. So although DO-IT should certainly be involved in these cybersecurity issues with this cybersecurity money, they may not be the ideal agency to disperse the money if there's an agency that already has experience in that. And the final issue that I have has to do with the resource sharing agreements, which is kind of an interesting issue. Just a little bit of background about that. There's a number of assets that the state has. The most common one is, say, a tower. And what they do is, say, a cell phone company wants to expand its service. It'll ask the state, you know, can we put some equipment on this tower so that we can have cell phone service in this area? Now, those cell phone towers are usually about a mile or two apart. 10 years ago, DO-IT came up with a schedule basically that says depending on the type of equipment and how much vehicular traffic there is around the tower. And they have 4 different groups for that now. And so if you have a tower in an area without a lot of traffic, that's less expensive. If the revenues that the state receives would be less than, but if, let's say if you're in the middle of a very large city, it would be more. So anyway, that's kind of how that works. And that works very well for these, especially for cell phone towers. What's happened recently is more people are what's called doing over-the-air television or OTA television. And what that basically is you can get your own antenna. They have them now that they have amplifiers in them. And you can watch the over-the-air broadcast from either TV Hill or, say, the MPT TV tower that's on I-97 a little bit to the north of Annapolis. So what happened was last year there was and one of these RSAs came for the MPT tower. And so what they used was they went to the standard tower system, and they figured out how many cars drive on I-97 every day. And that was the basis for the cost. The thing, though, about it is I'm not so sure that's the best way to do it, because the MPT tower goes all the way to the north of Baltimore, has a good signal, and also to the other side of Washington, D.C., and well into the east, across the Bay Bridge, too. So it seems like that's not the ideal. Also, that in February, another one came for a radio station in Salisbury. And so what we're recommending, my final, is that the department, this is narrative again, that they come up with a schedule for these kinds of resource sharing agreements. And also, I neglected to mention that it's really interesting because when I was looking to see how common this was, I came up with, for the 2020 and 21 season, putting together some Nielsen estimates of how many households there are viewing and how many of those have those television antennas. There's probably 48 million households in the U.S. that are having this. And one of the reasons this is becoming more common is the transmission now. You can put a lot more channels in a channel anymore. You could have a channel that has as much as 6 I've seen in it. What used to be just one channel, and the TV stations apparently are seeing this as a revenue source, as their other revenue sources dwindling. So they have actually put more content out there, and that seems to me has encouraged people to buy these antennas. And so it seems like it's hard to say how many more of these might be out there, but it seems like this is something that is a growing industry, believe it or not, after years and years of decline. So, with that, I will mention that there is a page with recommended actions. I talked about all 6 of them already. So I won't bring that up again. There is an exhibit that goes through all the 32 projects that get general funds, and I have appendices that for the Do It projects. That I'll conclude my remarks and take questions.
Well, thank you very much for that thoughtful analysis. Do any subcommittee members have a question? Senator Elfreth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Patrick, thank you. 2 quick questions. You mentioned that there was one, I don't want to call it a bad actor, but maybe an actor who was not reformed properly in a couple of years of challenges. Can you tell us who that is? Or
Yeah. It's the public defender.
Public defender. Okay, thank you. And then my second question on the contractual side of the budget, are those contracted employees or are those contracts for service?
Yeah, they're service contracts.
Service contracts.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Frank, in Exhibit 8, it talks about the positions, and I think you were talking about how we just can't be competitive with people. So is that a administration decision? Like, how does the needle get moved on that? Does that get moved by the governor putting in a budget that would increase the salaries, or does it take legislative action?
Well, I think this is a bigger problem than the Department of Information Technology.
Right.
I think what I kind of talk about is the salaries, and this is common, the salary scale is just too low. And probably the administration through DBM ought to have a higher salary scale. There may be, at the individual level, there may be some positions that Do It needs to reclassify into a higher pay scale. And that's a more, but if you have to reclassify every position into a higher pay scale, maybe the scale is the problem and not the classifications. So I don't know how helpful that is, but that is.
Thank you. Senator Quarterman.
Yes, thank you. Patrick, quick question. The last item, kind of, you were talking about the review of the RSAs,
Yeah.
RSAs with the towers and things like that. So can you clarify, are we talking about looking at broadcast more television? I mean, obviously, the MPT, excuse me, is, subsidized by the state, and that's why the towers, things like that. But what's the plan going forward? I guess maybe that might be a better question for Do It. We're talking about like regular broadcast channels being using those same towers? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what I'm saying is the state has, we're not talking about building towers or anything
Okay.
like that. What we're talking about, and this is kind of like, how does the internet work?
Sure.
Kind of question, in that there are these, if a tower's already, if somebody already has a tower and you would like a tower there, well, you can go to them and say, hey, can I give you some money, and then
Gotcha.
you'll let me put the equipment out. And this, what I guess the issue I'm making with this is the pricing for the towers that we have for cell phones is I think it was a very efficient and a very well conceived. But because they're about a mile or two apart, and the traffic nearby is a good indicator of how much usage you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
That said, the traffic around 97 has nothing to do with how many people in Baltimore are going to be watching a television show or something like that. And so maybe a new metric needs to be
No, and I appreciate
developed.
the comparison, so that makes it much more clear as far as, we're not talking about subsidizing the networks.
No.
We're talking about allowing them to use that space, and obviously would pay for that or whatever it may be, so I got you.
Right,
I'm
and
good.
just to see, well, I skipped over this exhibit. I'm going to
I'm
find
good.
it quickly.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. I think Senator Quarterman said he's going to follow up with you offline.
Great.
But thank you for the very detailed analysis. Mr. Secretary, come on up. Welcome. Secretary Leahy. Good to see you, and if you want to just introduce, your staff that are here, and if you can just respond to Mr. Frank's analysis, and appreciate you being here, sir.
Absolutely, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Michael Leahy, the Secretary of the Maryland Department of Information Technology. I'm joined today by Chip Stewart, the State Chief Information Security Officer, and I really appreciate the opportunity to appear to provide this testimony today. To begin, I'd like to thank Mr. Frank, our analyst, for all of his hard work. It's always a pleasure to work with him. And, we are in concert with Mr. Frank about most things he said. And I recognize you have a very busy schedule, so I'm not going to take up a lot of time. We have, in our written testimony, specified that we concur with the 6 recommendations he's made. And we will be looking into those and obviously reporting our results as we go forward. I'd like to take a moment, though, and talk about a couple of things that are accomplishments that I think play into the narrative of how we're doing in the IT world. And the first is something you just talked about, the issue about salary classification and competing. So in our annual salary review process with our colleagues at DBM, this past year, we've been able to create 22 new IT position classifications. So it not only deals with the issue of payment, but it specifies the skills. So classifications that were written 20 years ago didn't talk a lot about network engineering and utilization of the internet. So we're incorporating the utilization of modern methodologies and technologies. Second, we're one of the first states to put our cybersecurity positions in alignment with what's called the NICE framework, and I'll let Mr. Stewart speak to that more specifically. One of our biggest accomplishments, and again, I'm going to credit Mr. Stewart with making this occur, is we set up the state's own Security Operations Center. And that may not sound like a big deal, but it's operating and supervising our networks 24/7, 365. Previously, our coverage was not every day all the time. So that's a huge improvement for us. We've also upgraded the backbone network for Network Maryland to 100 gigabytes from 10, so tenfold increase in the amount of data that can pass through. We've consolidated data centers for a number of agencies into our two data centers that are privately operated, so we are taking advantage of the advantages of putting more in one place and consolidating the costs and the necessity for the equipment. Finally, the biggest question that I think we are going to all face going forward, as you mentioned, is the issue of how do we assess the risk associated with what security is appropriate? Because when I started this job, I started hearing all the time, it's not if, it's when. So we have several goals, and again, I'll let Chip speak to it. But from my standpoint, I have to assume the bad guys who only have to get in once can figure out a way more often than I would like to admit. So how we respond to those incidents and our ability to respond quickly and effectively, not only with regard to making sure the state systems are up and running properly, but the data on our citizens and on our operations is protected. So I'm very happy that the governor's office has moved to formalize operations for a data and privacy officer. If you'll recall, we at DoIT sponsored a bill 3 years in a row to do many of the things that this executive order does, because it just didn't make it through. So I'm gonna let Mr. Stewart talk about the major improvements in cybersecurity over this past year. And he's probably going to not toot his own horn enough, but in my eyes, he has done a stellar job, and I want to thank him for his efforts. Please, Chip.
Thank you, Secretary Leahy. I will try to apply the appropriate amount of tooting of the horn today. I appreciate the time, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Chip Stewart. I'm the State Chief Information Security Officer. The State Chief Information Security Officer is responsible for leading what's called the Office of Security Management. The Office of Security Management is responsible for the direction, coordination, and implementation of cybersecurity strategy and policy for all state agencies within the executive branch. As Secretary Leahy stated, we have made some pretty significant improvements over the past several years since the executive order was signed, with last year being just a phenomenal year for transformation for the team. The first big initiative I want to speak to is the transition from, for security operations from a contractor to an in-house security operations center. Mr. Frank came out and saw the facility. We run 24/7, 365 days a year, rain, snow, sun. The folks are there at one site to protect the networks. We've updated our email systems, the mail platform that we use, to get enhanced security enabled, and have done a lot with that. So one of the things I speak to with that is when somebody hits report phishing, that generates an automatic ticket in the SOC. And the SOC analyst will then go through that, evaluate whether it's a phishing message or not. They will then pull it from people's inboxes and isolate, and that enables just a far greater degree of security than without. Another interesting one is, I'm going to use some very technical terms, but I'll explain what it is in a second, volumetric denial of service protection. So one of the ways that the adversaries will try to disrupt network operations is just by flooding us with more data than we can handle. So through that, we now have multi-terabit per second protection, which means shy of some of the largest attacks in the world, we're able to maintain the availability of our networks, even in the face of that sort of attack, which is, again, just a tremendous improvement and something I think we're all very proud of. And then another one that we don't speak very frequently about, but I think it's worth mentioning. There's a lot of text messages and other fraudulent messages that go around. Unemployment's one of the biggest targets. They go to citizens, they say, hey, click on this link to update your credentials, claim some money. When those get reported to the Security Operations Center, we initiate a takedown of that site, sometimes before the bad guys even can get it up and running to steal data. So I think that's another thing I'm pretty proud of, because that's real impact for the citizens, and that's what we're really here to do, is to serve the citizens. Vulnerability and risk management, so we've done a lot to improve our vulnerability management. This is making sure that the systems that are exposed to the internet and other areas don't have vulnerabilities that would allow an adversary to easily get in. We've tripled the size of that program over the past, in calendar 21, from around 10,000 assets to now well over 30,000. And transition that to get more automation. So doing more with fewer people is another big initiative for us. As I think we've all heard, the number of open cybersecurity positions is staggering. Which gets to the next point, which is workforce development. As Secretary Leahy mentioned, we created 22 new job classifications. Most of those were security. They're based on what's called the NIST-NICE framework, which provides a pathway for workforce development for employees, both in their current role and transitioning into bigger roles. I think this helps us develop, attract, and retain talent, and it's the framework that I think you'll see used across the country. In speaking with the folks from that program, I believe we were the first state to implement that after it was published. So that's, I think, another thing to be pretty proud of. The last thing I'm going to dive into much detail is the threat intelligence and sharing platform. So we engage in cybersecurity threat and vulnerability sharing with other states, as well as other national level partners and other organizations that benefit from that. So what that gives us is the ability to know the things that the bad guys are doing and how they're doing it, which helps us better protect the network. I do want to speak to a moment about the managing for results. One of the things that happened during COVID was a series of unfortunately timed upgrades to the Windows operating system, and DoIT just didn't have a mechanism to easily achieve that with a remote workforce. That slowed down our ability to execute. As we work to improve that, we hold biweekly meetings with teams that have responsibility for each of the MFRs that security tracks, and we're seeing dramatic improvements in that as a result. I attached a graph to the written testimony that showed the scale of the improvement since last year. We went from, I think it was close to 161, I think, if I remember correctly, websites that were using outdated or unsupported encryption, down to 17. And it was 17 at the time of writing. I suspect we'll see that go even lower in the coming weeks and months. With that, I will thank everyone for their time today and ask if there's any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your service to the state. So I guess I don't want to know all the mechanisms of how we would be ready, but do you feel confident that the state of Maryland will be able to withstand a large-scale cyber attack at this point?
So I think that is a very loaded question.
Okay.
So I'm going to try.
I don't want you to get in trouble.
Yeah.
I just want to.
I'm going to try
And I don't want to know how. I just want to make sure that you all feel like you're confident that you are doing everything humanly possible to protect the state.
No, I think we've done a lot. We work with the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. So when you think about a security incident, you think about initially protecting, and then detecting, containing, and eradicating. So for protection, we've done a lot, such as the denial of service protection, vulnerability risk management. Something we didn't really cover in our testimony is the work we've done with Department of Emergency Management to focus on incident response. And we got an opportunity, unfortunately, to exercise that plan. And from a plan execution perspective, that was absolutely phenomenal. Phenomenal collaboration between state police, the MCAC, which is a fusion center, Maryland Department of Emergency Management, Department of IT, and the agency that was the victim. So I think, to wrap it up, I don't think there's any way we can protect against all cyber attacks, but I think we are trending in the direction we need to be prepared if it happens.
Thank you. Senator Elfreth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two quick questions. Mr. Stewart, thank you so much for being here and all you're doing. And thank you for mentioning the fraud that I know our offices see constantly. Should we be reporting that to your office when we hear from constituents they received one of those text messages? Or what's the protocol for us, since we are kind of a repository for citizen input?
So I think generally speaking, you should report it to the agency that it's claiming to be. So report it to the Department of Labor.
Okay.
They have pathways to reach out to us. And I think Pat Frank and I were talking about this when he was on site to see what we do. There are times where, because of the apparatus we have in place to detect something before it gets into production, we've taken down sites before the first text message hits a citizen. So, I mean, it's just, again, phenomenal tooling and work of the teams we have in place. I think that's really, I mean, I can't speak highly enough about the team we have.
Okay, so report to the agency it relates to, and then that will always get to you?
That will, if they report it back to us, it'll
Okay.
always get to us, and we action it quickly.
Okay.
And that's the best way to do that.
Got it, thank you. And then, just, Mr. Secretary, good to see you. We've heard a lot in this subcommittee and in the larger committee about some of our IT infrastructure challenges across state government.
Yes.
Does DoIT proactively think through some of those infrastructure challenges, even if that agency hasn't requested for you to do that? Or what is the relationship between DoIT and, let's say, because I had a bill on this yesterday, MHEC and their MD CAP system? What does that relationship look like?
Certainly. Well, you're probably aware that about 2 years ago now, we implemented what I call a plain English policy, that instead of talking about systems and technology, we want to start a conversation about what problem they're attempting to solve or address, and what workflows are associated with that, and then we will together find a technical solution. Saves many of the agencies the grief of vendors saying, buy my black box. So yes, we have a good discussion. As Mr. Frank noted, the number of major information technology projects is rising, as are the funds, and most of those, 95% this year, are modernization of legacy systems. We're not taking on absolutely everything because it's a prioritization of resources, but many of the significant issues facing the state based on our systems that are either no longer patched or have been in use, faithfully for a significant period of time are being addressed and are being looked at in the MITDP project. And I have regular discussions with secretaries from numerous agencies, talking to them about what's possible given the advances in data analytics, to be able to see whether what you're doing is working in real time. And many of these systems don't require a change in the actual workflow. It's rather a reprogramming and a standardization of modules that we can use the same financial module 8 places. For example, our one-stop portable, we're using the same licensing and permitting underlying back end for everybody rather than building a specialized one for each agency.
Okay. And just to clarify, how do you define a legacy system? Is there an age limit? And are you keeping the total list of systems across state government, or is it when an agency comes to you requesting help that you start advising?
Well, again, as Chip said, we have loaded questions. There are a number of instances because of modernizations in one agency that we will then go talk to another agency. You have similar processes. You are not using the same methodologies. Would you consider becoming part of this project? So we hear from agencies about what they want to do, and we do take the lead in attempting to show folks what's out there and what's possible by utilizing new technology. As to the definition of a legacy system, the definition we use at DoIT is twofold. First, first one is, it's one that the system and the software associated with it are no longer patchable because they're no longer supported by the original manufacturer. The second is software and systems, like everything else, are generational. So, you know, we have been talking about utilizing the cloud more effectively and efficiently for 10 years. So obviously, any systems that operate on a mainframe, in my mind, are legacy systems. So those are the two definitions we're using.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you so much.
Stewart, thank you very much. Colleagues, that concludes today's budget hearings. Hope you all have a great day. We're adjourned.